Welcome back to the Free Mind Podcast, where we explore topics in Western history, politics, philosophy, literature, and current events, with a laser focus on seeking the truth and an adventurous disregard for ideological and academic fashions. I'm Matt Burgess. My guest today is Lee Jussim. Lee Jussim is Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University and a founding member of both the Academic Freedom Alliance and the Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. In addition to being a renowned psychology researcher, Dr. Jussim is also an outspoken critic of cancel culture and the politicization of his discipline of social psychology and of academia writ large. For his efforts, he has been the target of cancellation attempts. We discuss his career path, his research on stereotypes and other controversial topics, his brushes with cancel culture, the risks of becoming reactionary when facing cancellation attempts, and his tips for maintaining integrity and principles in the face of these pressures. Lee Jussim, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
As we'll talk about over the next hour or so, you have an interesting relationship with cancel culture, both as somebody who I would say has conquered it without being conquered by it, and being consumed by it or changed, ideologically and scientifically by it. So we'll talk about that. But first, I want to ask you about your background, because my recollection from reading about it is that you have an interesting background and upbringing and path to academia, particularly in comparison to what some of your critics might otherwise wrongly assume about you. So tell me about that. How'd you get to be where you are?
Well, let's see. How do I keep this short? I hated school and was on a quest to undermine my high school as much as possible, which got me in and out of trouble throughout all of high school. And I went to college and hated that also, dropped out, went back, dropped out like 3 times ultimately. Eventually got my degree. And when I went back the final time, the idea of having a job that you just love doing was like not in my background. I grew up in a Brooklyn public housing project, and jobs were things you got to make money and survive. The idea of having like a satisfying career was like not on my radar. It just didn't in my. Maybe there were some of the kids had that, but not in most of my circles. So when I finally went back to college, it was like, given that like doing something because you love to do it was off the table. Well, what should you do? You should try and find a field where you can make boatloads of money in, right? Because why not make boatloads of money if there's no option for actually like enjoying work? So I actually started out. When I finally returned, I was going to major in something like economics or business or something like that. And because I'd been out of school for a while, I only signed up for 3 courses. I figured let's make it not too hard, and I'll get used to it. I'll sort of put my toe in the collegiate water and see how things go. So I did that, but then having been in and out of colleges before, I realized that the bureaucracy is fundamentally evil. It functions as if it's evil, and that the university bureaucracies will do all sorts of things to ruin your life if they can. So given that was the case, I anticipated the possibility that even though I believed I had registered for 3 courses, they were going to kick me after the fact. After the semester started, they were going to kick me out of 2 of them. It was fully enrolled, and I didn't realize it, and I was like low on the totem pole because I was a new student. There were a million reasons the bureaucracy can have for doing that. Rutgers, this is infamous at Rutgers, where students get deregistered all the time. So they register and then they get kicked out. So this is not some delusion on my part. So I figured, okay, I don't want to ruin my entire semester. So assuming I get kicked out of 2 courses, I probably should register for 5, and then I can just drop 2. So in thinking about that, I'm like, okay, what did I despise least when I went to school the first time? And that was psychology. So don't I did not like psychology. I hated it. I just hated it less than I hated everything else. So I registered for 2 psych courses. So I started going to these 5 courses. And within 2 weeks, I loved both psych courses. Like, I just loved both courses. And neither were taught by particularly charismatic professors. So it wasn't like they were some sort of smart. One was like so dry. He probably would put most of the rest of the students to sleep, but I loved the material. The other guy was not that dry, but he was a good teacher. He wasn't anything amazing. And one was a course on learning and memory. The other was a course on social psychology. And I love both of them. Had the learning and memory guy made an announcement in his class, I'm working on all these research projects, undergraduates are invited to help, I'd love to have you help me, I would have signed up for that. But he didn't. The social psychologist did. I signed up to work with this guy, and by the end of the semester, I loved it. I just loved everything about it. And at the end of that very first semester, having spent most of the semester doing research with this guy, he and actually the learning and memory guy were sort of I had advice. It was a small school, so they both sort of functioned as my advisors. And I went up into his office, and which you could do easily. And I said, "Okay, what do I have to do to become a social psychologist?" And he laid it out, and the rest is history. So that is my background.
That's great. And so tell me a little bit about your career and what you've researched and how you got interested in it. Because I imagine there's a lot of people who know your newer stuff, but maybe even know some of your older stuff on stereotype accuracy, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But yeah, how did you get into what were your original research topics, and how would you define your major interests and how they came about?
Yeah, I mean, the originally I had really 2 main interests, which were really how stereotypes bias person perception. So person perception is judgments of a particular individual. It's not like general beliefs. So how would my beliefs about your demographic statuses influence or bias or distort my judgments about you? That would be stereotypes and person perception. And then the other was on self-fulfilling prophecies, especially self-fulfilling prophecies in educational, in K to 12 type contexts, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Can you give an example for our lay audience?
Of self-fulfilling prophecy or stereotype bias? So sure. Let's say I'm a teacher, you're a 6th grade student in my class. And how this came to be is beyond the scope of what I was doing, but for some reason, I hold an inordinately high expectation for you. And so the self-fulfilling prophecy hypothesis would be that you would do even better in the class with me than you would otherwise have done, because my expectations would lead me to treat you particularly favorably, give you opportunities that maybe I don't give other students, be more forgiving of your errors, and ultimately you actually do better in the class. Of course, the flip side is if I had a negative expectation for you, it would undermine your achievement. So that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay. And so you got interested in that and you researched it, and what were some of your main findings?
Okay, well, so that was my ass backwards entree into accuracy, and accuracy was my ass backwards discovery of the sort of extent of political moral agendas driving much social science research. It was all ass backwards. So I would do these studies of stereotypes and person perception, and we found bias in many of those studies. But the biases tended to be small effect sizes.
Biases of the sort that people might expect. So biases against women, biases against minorities in certain settings, things like that.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. That's right. We did race, we did sex, we actually did sexuality, sexual orientation. So we did a slew of these things.
And in what context?
Well, and so sometimes we would do these as experimental lab studies. So actually my job talk involved people evaluating black and white job applicants who, via their so they saw actually slides. This was 1980s, so it was low tech. They saw slides and heard video recordings of black and white job applicants who dressed as if they were sort of affluent middle class or kind of working class. They were in an appropriate jacket and tie, but it would be like this sort of cheap jacket, this kind of weird wide tie. Well, that was the low. The affluent ones looked, kind of business sharp and stuff. And also, they spoke in standard or non-standard speech styles. So there's standard English. This was my advisor at the time, had expertise in sociolinguistics, is the sort of study of language and perception of language and how people use it. So the um, the term was network English. So in the 1980s, the network news anchors spoke without any discernible accent. They just spoke in this sort of straightforward kind of style. Whereas in the non-standard dials, we created, in order to make it credible for both black and white job applicants, we created this non-standard style that was sort of a mix of Brooklynese and Black English.
Okay.
So,
And is the thing you're trying to test basically tease apart class bias, culture bias from just strict racial bias?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's right. So how much is there straight race bias versus to what extent do people assume that white people are richer than black people? Well, if you can control for the appearance of affluence, well, then you can get at race bias more purely, but also see to what extent is there social class bias. So anyway, so that would be one. We also did it in classrooms, through the teacher expectation stuff. You could, we had these very rich data sets with students' prior standardized test scores and their grades and their future standardized test scores and grades. And we did test the extent to which teachers' beliefs about students, their perceptions of students, were influenced by their records versus their demographics. And
what'd you find?
Okay, so we consistently found very small bias effects. Bias effects like regression, standardized regression coefficient is about 0.1, 0.15. So
along which axes or both?
It was both. It was mostly both. It wasn't every analysis, but you got the biases you would expect for race and sex. But the main predictor of teacher expectations, that was like 7-8 times as large, was the kid's actual achievement. So It's not that there was no bias. There was bias, but the bias was tiny in comparison to the extent to which teachers were in touch with reality. So we sort of got the same thing with the experimental job applicant studies, where when you controlled for, as we did, speech style and social class, there was actually, what we found was a slight tendency to favor the black applicants. So when the black applicants were just as upper class and spoke just as standard as white applicants, people favored them over the white applicants. Now, again, the effect was small, but it was there. So okay, so in doing these are the first quasi accuracy findings. Judging people on their merits or on their personal characteristics, you can have a almost philosophical discussion as whether that's accuracy or not, but it's kind of accuracy like. So we started doing that with teacher expectations. To what extent are teacher expectations self-fulfilling? To what extent do my expectations for you cause your achievement? Versus to what extent, if I have a high expectation or a low expectation for you, to what extent is that accurate? And what is accuracy? Accuracy is predictive validity without causal influence. So if I say it's going to rain later today and it rains, I was right. I didn't cause it to rain. Now just because we're dealing with something social, the principle holds. If I say Matt is going to win his next tennis match and I'm not playing the match, you're playing against somebody else, and you
You're
win the
certainly going
match.
to be wrong about that, but go ahead.
Okay, right. So maybe I'd be wrong about that, right? So then that would be incorrect. But if you did win the match, then I would simply be right. I didn't call. Now I could be your coach. Now, if I'm your coach and I work with you and I train you and you win the match, well, then I might have helped cause you to win the match. But here, thousands of miles away, I'm not causing you to win the match. I'm simply correct. And same thing with teachers and students. Teachers' expectations may predict student achievement, but it's like an empirical question. How much of that is because they're self-fulfilling versus because they actually know which kids are smart and which ones aren't, which ones are
And
going to
how do
do
you
well?
figure out if they're self-fulfilling or not?
Basic regression equations, right? You have teacher expectations early in the year predicting student achievement at the end of the year, right? Now, that's just a simple correlation. Okay, so the question is, what explains that correlation? So if you use prior achievement as a predictor of both teacher expectations and students' future achievement, the
Gotcha.
relationship between teachers is going to drop dramatically, right? And if you think of it as like a three-variable model, I don't know how much your listeners are going to know something like path analysis, but if you have um, past
Probably
achievement.
most of them not, but
Okay, if past achievement is a basis for teacher expectations, past achievement is a basis for future achievement, right? I mean, a kid who's done well, all throughout school is probably going to do well this year. Teachers probably pick up on that. So if a teacher predicts a kid who's been doing really well is going to continue to do really well, they're probably right. So using regression, you can kind of tease all that out.
gotcha. Okay. And what was the answer?
The answer was sort of much like the stereotype stuff. Teacher expectations were consistently self-fulfilling, but the effects were small. Across multiple studies, about 2/3 or more of the relationship between teacher expectations and student achievement was accuracy. They just knew which kids were smarter and which ones weren't. But there was some self-fulfilling effect in all of the studies that we did.
And so
So
how does that bring you to accuracy, and what is accuracy?
Yeah, accuracy is predictive validity without causal influence. That's what I would call accuracy, right? So if you just predict an outcome and it comes true and you didn't cause it to come true, then you were simply right. If I predict the stock market's going to go up, even right, I'm one person and I'm not like a bond wizard or something like that. I'm not some guy who can move markets. If I buy 100 shares of some stock, it's not really going to change the stock market. But if I predict the market's going to go up and it goes up, then I'm simply right. I'm not causing it to go up. So there's just a million things like that. So that's how I began to sort of stumble onto accuracy, and it became clear very early that many in my field did not like the idea that that person perception judgments were based primarily on individuating information, that is, the personal characteristics of the person being judged, rather than stereotypes. So if I'm judging you mainly on it depends on the context, education or work, on your competence, your accomplishments, not your race or sex or anything else. Although there is a little bit of that, mostly it's judging you on your merits. Okay, so they didn't like that. And then, of course, the self-fulfilling prophecy, once upon a time, 60s, 70s, 80s, was much like implicit bias and microaggressions are now, a major tool for, sort of social justice like thinking and efforts in the social sciences. So, teachers are this instrument of racism and sexism because their expectations are self-fulfilling and all this sort of stuff. And the idea that, well, actually they're mostly accurate cuts against that grain. So that's how I sort of stumbled into the political sensitivities of the field. But then it gets better. So as I just laid out, I started out studying stereotype biases. This is what social psychologists have been doing this since like the 1920s and 1930s, studying. So I
Sure.
was,
Major
as a
topic.
grad student, I'm trained in the field. I'm just doing whatever, I'm doing what a good social psychologist, I'm trying to be a good social psychologist, doing what people do, which is studying stereotype biases. Okay. But then I stumble on this accuracy stuff. And I start reviewing the literature, first for just individual articles, then for review type papers. And there are all these claims in the literature through like the 80s and 90s that stereotypes are inaccurate. And you still see this. You'll see this The national funding agencies will denounce doing anything based on stereotypes and all this sort of stuff, which is fine, sort of fine.
And now we're talking about groups, because before you were talking about
Yes, now we're talking
individuals.
about groups. We're talking
Now
accuracy
we're
and
talking about
perception
groups.
of
Okay.
groups. That's right. So I'm going into the literature. There's all these claims, testaments to the inaccuracy of stereotypes. And I'm trying to be reasonably scholarly, and I try to get down to the original data supporting the claims that stereotypes are inaccurate. So where is this wealth of data showing that stereotypes are inaccurate?
And just to be clear about what we're talking about, when you say stereotypes are inaccurate or they're accurate, we're talking about basically claims about group means or something, right? We're not talking about like extending
Sort of.
group-based claims to
I would
individuals.
yes. We're talking about stereotypes as perceptions of groups. Yes, absolutely. But exactly what we're talking about is sort of hard to pin down because in reviewing and doing just sort of hardcore scholarly scientific reviews of the literature, what I stumbled upon is that there was almost no there. And what I mean by that is an article would make some claim to the effect of stereotypes being inaccurate, and then it branched. In one branch, the claim would appear without a reference. So they're just making the claim. And that means there is no reference. There's no original source for me to track down that provided evidence for that claim. There's no source because they didn't cite anything. So that's branch one. Branch two was they did cite something. So I would go to what they said. It's like, okay, when I first started doing this, okay, now I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to find out why my field is constantly declaring stereotypes inaccurate. I'm going to get to the original data. And I would get to that paper. That paper would also declare stereotypes to be inaccurate, and it would have no data.
So circular referencing, basically.
It was circular reference. It was my first discovery of idea laundering, and so there was really very little. There were pervasive claims. The literature was filled with the presumption, sort of like the sky is blue. You wouldn't really need a reference to declare the sky to be blue. That's what stereotypes are inaccurate was. It's like saying the sky was blue, but there was no evidence underlying it. So then, around that time, Clark Macaulay, who has since retired, I think, started doing empirical research on the accuracy of stereotypes. And he would do this by asking people, he mostly did racial stereotypes, as I remember, did race and sex. And he would ask people for their beliefs that mapped onto census data. So you go into the census data to find out what proportion of blacks and whites have high school diplomas, are on welfare, have been convicted of a crime, have been a victim of a crime. I mean, you can find out zillions of things in just the census data about all sorts of group differences. So he did that and then just asked people to estimate the black and white levels of getting a high school degree and being on welfare and committing a crime, being victim of a crime. He had a slew of things. And lo and behold, what he finds, and these are small scale studies, you don't want to make too much of them, but lo and behold, what he finds is people are stunningly accurate. The correlations between people's beliefs and the census data are like 0.8, 0.9 consistently. So,
with a slope of 1 or no? Meaning, they're correlated, but are they also, getting the magnitude of the differences right?
So that's a very interesting question. There were a slew of those early studies, especially on race and sex. Janet Swim was another social psychologist who actually did this. There was more evidence. So one of the common claims in the stereotype literature, which goes back to Gordon Allport and Henri Tajfel, that stereotypes lead to exaggerations of group differences. That claim is also all over the literature. What Macaulay and Swim were finding in these early studies, 80s and 90s, of race and sex stereotypes was that there was sometimes evidence of exaggeration. People perceived more of a difference than there really was, but there was actually more evidence of people underestimating the differences than overestimating them. So there was certainly no clear pattern of exaggeration. I mean, that was really falsified by that early research, which isn't to say people never exaggerate real differences. That, but that early evidence was completely inconsistent with the claim that an inherent feature of stereotypes is they lead people to exaggerate real differences.
Okay, so would the following be an accurate lay summary of what we understand about these things? And that is the following. Basically, people are intuitive Bayesians, so they form prior expectations based on information either about salient groups that somebody belongs to if they don't know them, or about past performance if they do know them. They form those prior beliefs. Those prior beliefs can cause small biases in how they treat people, basically anticipating.
Perception. Treatment is a different issue than judgment. So these are not studies of discrimination. These are studies of
you
judgment.
You were talking about, I thought at the beginning you were talking about studies of, for example, hiring discrimination, and then self-fulfilling prophecies. We don't necessarily know what the treatment is, but we infer there is one based on the fact that we're finding a non-zero effect, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And there's lots of, if you take it out of the politically salient context of race and gender, in white collar professions, say, I would say there's pretty compelling anecdotal examples of this type of thing. So, one that I can think of being a big basketball fan is Jeremy Lin, who was, consistently underestimated by coaches and scouts compared to his statistics, plausibly partly because he was Asian American, which is a very underrepresented group in the NBA. And then, when he was given a chance, he would outperform coaches' expectations kind of for the same reason. But on the other hand, he still made the NBA, and I don't know, in terms of speaking now to the idea that these effects are ultimately small. I haven't seen a study of this, but I would imagine in sports where you can measure performance really well, it's not probably that common that somebody, goes completely unnoticed despite consistently outperforming their expectations, especially in the age of Moneyball. So, who would have thought that Moneyball was the solution to racism in the NBA? But, maybe it is.
Right. Although when they first developed Moneyball, they exploited the fact that some players were over and underestimated. Right. That was the entire mechanism. But that was mostly individual. It was not so much demographic, as far as I know. But
some of the others, we don't know why, various people that were underestimated by the scouts were underestimated, right? I don't know anything about baseball, unlike basketball, right? So there may be some cases where there was some demographic thing or something else, like wasn't one of the pitchers for the Oakland A's in the story, he threw funny, and so people underestimated him for that.
Yeah, right. That's right. Exactly. That's right.
So let me link this now to another academic bugbear of yours, which is implicit bias in the IAT. Because, a naive, uninitiated person to this debate might say, okay, it sounds like you're describing people sometimes making small but still occasionally consequential, inaccurate judgments about individuals based on priors, using their fast brain. That kind of sounds like unconscious bias, doesn't it? And so, if not, why not? And if so, then what's the problem with the implicit bias framework beyond just the test, the IAT, which you can talk about if you want? Doesn't measure it very well.
Yeah, well, so the core problem is that, I don't know, some huge proportion of the claims about implicit bias are based on the IAT. That is the core problem. Whether or not, people, people are subject to all sorts of biases. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for identifying a slew of errors and biases and heuristics that people use, presumably without being aware that that's what they're doing, right? That these are logical errors. People don't purposely make logical errors. So in that sense, you could say, well, that's implicit bias. But implicit bias doesn't mean the availability heuristic. So if you listen to the availability heuristic, is that when people are asked to, think about some sort of how often something happens, their answer is like what comes to mind easily, not some sort of ultimate assessment of the frequency of the event, which they're not really capable of doing.
And just to put a fine point on it, that the IAT, which is the implicit association test, basically measures how quickly you associate, say, science with different demographic groups, but then incorrectly people interpret the results as saying you would be biased against those groups, which often people find that you're not. Is that basically the issue?
Right. Yes. I mean,
yeah.
So the IAT is the outcome is a reaction time. Right. It's just how quickly people do the test. That's not a bias in any universe. It's right. It's just a reaction time. So that the test has been called a measure of implicit bias is delusional. It's completely delusional. Now, it is an empirical question whether those reaction time differences predict or correspond to other kinds of biases. And that evidence is really all over the map.
Okay. And isn't it the case that at least two of the three inventors of the IAT agree with what you just said? Not that it really matters, but...
there has been a very slow, grudging retreat from some of the claims, some of the more melodramatic claims common in the 90s and early 2000s, but not many. And I think what I see is a willingness to retreat only when overwhelmingly compelled to do so, partially as a retreating vanguard move to protect the core ideas and core claims. So there's a recent special issue of Datalist. This is which
I know Datalist.
The National Academies of Science, and on implicit bias. It's mostly by advocates. If you read that, there's very little acknowledgement. There's little hints here and there. There's not much in the way of acknowledgement of the many limitations and failures of work based, especially on the IAT.
So let me just ask one more question, and then I want to move on. Just to put a fine point on it for the average person who goes to an HR training, right? And may but has a skeptical mind and maybe also reads your and some other people's stuff criticizing the IAT. Would the following be a accurate statement? If I was talking to such a person, going to an HR training, I would say, if somebody says to you that take an IAT and it'll tell you how racist you are, that's BS. But on the other hand, there is evidence that people do sometimes misapply group-based perceptions to individuals, with small effect, but measurable effect, and that's probably associated with your fast brain. And therefore, if you slow down in your deliberations, and if you focus on more, data-driven empirical measures for selecting, say, job candidates, that those are good ways to minimize unconscious bias that might make you make worse hiring decisions also in biased ways. How am I doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. That we're all subject to all sorts of biases. You never want to underestimate that. But the fix is fairly straightforward, and at least if you're right. Again, remember, this is about unconscious bias. I mean, there are going to be some people who hold antipathies, blatant, explicit antipathies. This is not going to solve anything among those people. So, if you hate people from Bhutan, me urging you to judge people on their merits is like, I don't really give a damn, because I don't want anybody from Bhutan working in my company. So it's not going to solve that problem. But if you're a reasonable, decent person who wants to hire the best person or admit the best student, and you're cognizant of some potential to judge people in a biased manner. The solution is really simple, exactly as you were saying, to slow down, really evaluate, figure out what are your standards here? What are you looking for, whether it's a job or graduate admissions or undergraduate admissions or really anything else? What are you looking for? What are the criteria that a person could demonstrate that would show that they're appropriate or a strong candidate for the job, and focus on whether the extent to which they exhibit those criteria. That's the issue. That's what you want to know.
One more little question that's kind of related that just came up, but I think is potentially important, related to your Bhutan example, sort of. Right. So because some people talk about the way these trainings can backfire. And one of the ways I think they can backfire is making differences more salient than they otherwise would, and therefore triggering people's us versus them psychology more than they otherwise would. So, how strong is the evidence for backfire in that respect? And then the second way I think backfire, I can imagine maybe arising, is with self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So people say there's self-fulfilling prophecies if you get the impression that your teacher doesn't think highly of you. What if the New York Times is or your teacher is telling you every day that you'll never succeed on account of your demographics and
Right.
the systems that are stacked against you? So what's the
the evidence is
how much evidence is there on that? If any?
There's not a lot of there's a lot of speculation on that. There is pretty good evidence that mandatory, basically coercive diversity type trainings are ineffective, but it's not really clear why.
Gotcha.
So, are there backlash effects? I mean, there might be. It could be that just being required to do it is a pain in the ass. It's like, just let me do my damn job, and it's not exactly increasing racial or other intergroup resentments. It's just increasing resentment for having to endure this ridiculous training, right? I suspect that that's some of what's going on with the trainings. On the sort of steady diet of the media saying, the society is like hopelessly hierarchical, and you and your group have no hope whatsoever. That's a very big claim. It's very hard to get really good data, but I believe I can't identify a source at this point, but I'm pretty sure there's survey data showing that younger people believe that, are more likely to believe things like the system is rigged and, you can't get ahead and all this sort of stuff. So, but I don't know do they believe that any more than they did 50 years ago? I don't really know.
Well, and does it affect their performance and their choices?
Yeah.
The anecdote that always makes me think of this is a young woman I know who, I guess it's a few years ago now, but when she was in high school, she went to an all girls school. She was the head of the robotics club, really into STEM, really excelled at it. And then this is in Toronto. She got invited to go to a Women in STEM Day. And this was right after a Canadian woman had won the Nobel Prize in Physics, which was a big deal, Donna Strickland. And so she went to this is shortly before this person I know was applying to college. And so she went to this Women in STEM Day thinking it was going to be about, we just won the Nobel Prize in Physics and here are all the cool things women do in STEM. And of course, what it actually was speaker after speaker saying, this is how horrible it is going to be for you if you go into STEM as a woman. And of course, this person I know did not end up majoring in STEM. And so, and I always think of that like, gosh, that's such a tragic case of backfire. Anyway, I want to move on though, and talk about your relationship with cancel culture. Let's start with the recent. Wait.
No, I want to do an epilogue on this because this is this amazing paper that came out that sort of touches on that sort of will wrap a lot of this up into a nice, neat bow. So first, let me do an entree with direct personal experience. During my last term as site chair, intermittently, I would have female faculty come up to me, usually as a plea in some sort of bargaining thing to try and get a raise, how female faculty are underpaid. Right? And everybody knows this. This is like, there's bias throughout the system, So in my last year, when there wasn't much they could do about it, I did an analysis I had access to everybody's salary data. And at the assistant professor level, men and women were paid almost identically. At every other level, at associate professor, full professor, and then the highest level at Rutgers is distinguished. Some people have named chairs, but fold them all into distinguished professor. Women were paid more than men, and it was often pretty substantial. So that was actually a very interesting experience because it didn't stop the lobbying for higher pay, but it did eliminate the rhetoric around women being underpaid. So that's a personal experience.
Yeah, we had a pretty interesting thing here with that, where so our state Colorado passed an Equal Pay for Equal Work Act and said, basically fix your equal pay or else.
Yeah.
So our university addressed this by fitting basically a regression, but that didn't include gender as a variable. So they didn't actually test to see if there was a disparity. And what they did was they said, if you're below the line and you're female, we'll give you a raise. So in kind of a hilarious way, they opened themselves up to lawsuits from both sides because they have, there are literal cases in some departments of, there's some departments that have standard pay scales for new assistant professors where there's no negotiating. This is just what you get. And so now there's some cases where you got a male and a female hired at the same time at the same salary and performed similarly. And now the female's paid more, and the university has told her it's because you're female. So there's open up to lawsuits from males in that case. But then there's also exposure to lawsuits from females because they sent basically letters to a bunch of women who are seniors saying, we think you're underpaid because of your gender, and here's how much we think it is. And of course, some of them are saying, well, we want back pay. And so it's like, and I remember when I asked an administrator once why they didn't include gender in their regression that was supposedly measuring gender disparities. They said, well, we're not economists. Okay, well, you've got a whole department full of them,
I know.
Anyway,
right. Oh my God. Okay. All right. So,
go ahead.
So this is the kicker. So, paper came out within the last year that examined audit studies of sex-based job discrimination. So, an audit study is an experimental study in which the researchers send job application materials to real jobs. And it's an experiment because they vary the demographics. So it's common to do this with black or white names. These studies were with male and female names. So they're fake applicants. And what's great about this, if you do it with a fake applicant, you can make sure that Bob and Barbara have an identical resume. Right. Okay. So this was a meta-analysis of 45 years of such studies. There was scores of such studies.
Oh, this came out recently. I saw this, but yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Right. Okay. Yeah. So the main finding was no overall evidence of sex discrimination over the 40 years. There was non-significant tendency for men to be favored before around 2000, 2005, 2009, something like that. And after that, it flipped. There's another slight tendency to favor women after that. But all of these effects were really tiny. And if I remember correctly, not even statistically significant. Okay, that's not even the most interesting thing. I mean, that was the core thing of the study. That is very interesting.
And just to be clear, my recollection of the study was that they found small bias against men in female-dominated fields throughout the time, and then small bias against women in male-dominated fields, which flipped in around 2009, 2010 to being pro-female bias.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what they found.
Yeah.
My favorite finding from the paper, though, is not the gender discrimination, because that is what it is, and it turned out that there's not much of a there. They asked lay people and two types of academics to predict what their meta-analysis would find.
And
That
they
is,
were way off positively, right?
right. So both lay people and academics wildly overestimated how much how much the biases would favor men. It was just, they massively overestimated that. The academics slightly less than the lay people, but not very much. But here's to me, this is the best finding in the entire paper. There were two types of academics, just academics across the disciplines, and academics who identified themselves as having expertise in gender. So these are supposed experts at,
And they were more biased, probably, right?
they were not more biased. They were no less biased. They overestimated sexist biases to the exact same extent as chemistry professors and physics professors and professors who knew nothing, had no bona fide expertise in any of this stuff. And what's amazing to me about that is, although technically they were asked to predict the result of the meta-analysis was historical. It was based on 40
Right.
plus years of research. So
In their
this is
field.
really in their field.
Yeah.
So this is an utter failure of the gender experts throughout academia to understand and recognize the exceedingly low, near zero levels of sex discrimination out there in the data that they should have actually known about. This actually, to me, harks back to your interview with Diego Raniero,
Okay.
which was on political biases in the field. And they, without going into deep dive on their study, they did the study. They found, they claim to have found no difference in replicability. I'm going to put aside my reservations about that study. Almost none of the scholarship on political biases is about replicability. It's about stuff like this. It's about people claiming things that are just not true in the data. Now, just think through zillions of gender experts believing for 40 years that there are pervasive biases against women, communicating that to their colleagues, to their students, right? I mean, they probably didn't keep it to themselves. It's highly unlikely that they kept that view to themselves. And so if you accept that they probably sometimes discussed it, then what you have is academia pervaded by discourse emphasizing sexist bias, when in fact the data, at least with respect to the kinds of employment situations that this meta-analysis addressed, shows no bias whatsoever. That is the political bias. It has nothing to do with replicability.
It's certainly an example of political bias. One of the things, two quick asides for those interested, check out my interview with Diego Raniero that aired recently, and also check out Lee's Psychology Today article if you want to learn more about his concerns about Raniero's paper. Now, that said, I think as long as we're on this parallel between political bias and other types of bias, I do think it's interesting that the hypothesis that I think they started with is reasonable, at least to me on its face. How they measure it, we don't have to go into the details, but the hypothesis that if there's bias against group X, then group X needs to be better to make it, right? That's kind of what underlies this replicability test. It's certainly a common narrative in the context of things like gender, right? You have to work twice as hard to get half as far, I think is a common saying people use. Have there been studies to test that? Like, do you have to have a significantly better CV to get accolades or promoted, as a female or a minority? I believe I'm aware of some studies with accolades that find the opposite, but what's your, have people taken the Raniero approach to those types of biases?
My understanding is that there's only a small, with respect to demographic biases, there's only a small number of studies that address that, and they do show the opposite. That it's like easier to get tenure with that women have an easier time getting tenure meaning that they'll have a weaker vita than men. So there's a just study of German sociologists where that was kind of resoundingly true, and stuff. So whether it's always true, so some of the pushback would be, well, but this academic life is so much harder for women that,
Yeah, and there's biases in
and
peer review and all those kinds of things.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but just on the simple apples to apples Vita question, there's evidence that if anything, the bias is going the other direction. And there is some older work, and I think there's a lot that controlling for things like number of publications, status of publications, if I remember correctly, that openly conservative academics end up at lower status institutions.
Yeah, I think I've seen that kind of thing in passing too. Okay, this is all fascinating stuff, but I want to make sure we get to cancel culture. So
Yes. Okay.
early in your career, wrote some papers that basically said, if I'm paraphrasing what you just said earlier, biases are small. People accurately perceive individual differences. People accurately perceive differences in group means. And people probably didn't like that you were saying that. So what happened? Tell me about your first brushes with cancel culture.
Yeah, I mean, in the grand sweep of things, it was fine. The stuff got published in good journals. Um, there was some harsh and a couple of personal experiences that were kind of nasty, but I wouldn't even call them. They were just sort of like people being
Yeah.
assholes.
And to be
and
fair,
it's like,
that's been my experience too with, writing
yeah,
heterodox kind of
yeah,
stuff, on climate scenarios, for example.
I'll see the stuff
Been
on social media, especially on Twitter, where I'll do a little rant on political bias or something like that, and then there'll be some far lefty professor will do this dunk. This happened on and off for years. Oh, Jussim's just pissed off because the journals won't publish his papers, which I've never said that, and it's not true. I mean, I have not.
right.
I've had a
Yeah.
very nice career. The journals have published my papers. I'm like not complaining about that.
Well, and actually, I think there's a really important point here for young scholars, right? The most impactful research occurs at the intersection of what's important and what isn't being done. And you have to think, why isn't it being done? And there's a number of different categories. I won't bore you with all of them, but certainly one of them is people are afraid to do it, right? And it's and it's otherwise obvious. Right. And you can actually have, I think, a large impact and be rewarded for it in the big scheme of things by doing that. And that's certainly been my experience with scenarios. Interesting thing I find I'm seeing now is now I've got some research that's kind of displeasing to the left and some that's displeasing to the right. And so more or less, everybody just kind of leaves me alone now. It's like, well, okay, he's not on a team. I'm not quite sure if I like him or don't, and whose job it is to cancel him anyway. But okay, so let's fast forward then. You got some criticism, but nothing of the cancel variety for your early research. But you've been an early member, maybe even a founding member of Heterodox Academy. You've been outspoken about political bias in the academy for, at least a decade, if not more. And this all comes to a head in 2020 when academia has what's the diplomatic way to say, a moment of upheaval. And not only are you this visible heterodox person, you are the chair of the psychology department at Rutgers. Yeah. And what happens?
Yeah, well, I mean,
that you can discuss.
Yeah. So there are several. There are actually several of these events, but the most extreme one, and perhaps the most interesting one, was the Fiedler on the Roof.
Oh, good. Okay. Tell me about this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So Klaus Fiedler was editor of Perspectives on Psych Science. This was a big journal in psychology. A European psychologist submits a paper that's sort of a two-headed paper. It's sort of a critique of a previous paper by a biracial scholar, which will turn out to be relevant, advocating for diversity in all the ways that people advocate for diversity. Right? It's like psychology. The participants are uh, um, non-white participants have been understudied. There's too few editors who aren't white, and all this needs to be changed. And we need to have extensive pro-diversity initiatives and positionality statements. It's just sort of all this stuff. So Hummel submits this article that is starts as a critique of that article, but then uses it, my take on it, uses the critique as a platform to argue that the arguments for diversity, which are usually restricted to groups that progressives deem oppressed or underrepresented, the scientific arguments are true writ large for all sorts of groups. So there's a social justice or reparative justice argument to be made for affirmative action and racial preferences and anything like that. But that's different than the scientific argument. The scientific argument is that people bring different perspectives and different
Right.
backgrounds, and that this improves the science and all that sort of stuff. So Hummel points out, in my opinion, correctly, that if it's about the quality of the science, then diversity is way more than race, and it's way
Sure.
more than oppressed groups. So Fiedler sends this out for review. He sends it to me and two or three other people. The reviews are very positive of Hummel's review, which means they are implicitly critical of this earlier paper, because
Yep.
Hummel is critical of this earlier paper. So Fiedler then invites Roberts, the author of the original paper, to respond to this set of critiques.
Well, hang on. Aren't you skipping part where Fiedler invites the
Oh, yes,
reviewers
I
to
did. Right.
publish
Yes.
their
So,
reviews?
right. Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Fiedler thought the reviews were sufficiently thoughtful and interesting that the discussion should be made public. So he invited all three or four of us who did, I guess, three of us plus Hummel. So three of us did the reviews to scale up our reviews into a commentary. Okay. So we do that. And then Roberts is invited to respond. You could make a case that Fiedler kind of was more difficult. Some people would make the case that Fiedler was more difficult with Roberts than he should have been. So there's a lot of emails back and forth, and the reason we know this is because eventually Roberts got
Roberts
fed
released
up,
everything. Yeah.
and he released it all. So it's all public now. When he released it, he denounced Fiedler, all of us, and especially me, as racists. And this triggered this social media mob, this massive mob, an absolute
And a
cancellation.
petition, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, there was an open letter. Signed by almost 1,400 academics.
Yeah, one of them I think is now our dean of natural sciences. Anyway.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Neither here nor there.
Oh man, you're leaving though, right?
Yeah. Not because of that, to be absolutely clear.
Yeah, well,
Not for any political reason. Just to be absolutely clear, in case anybody ever wonders or asks.
Right. So the APS, the Association for Psych Science, which was the organization that publishes the journal, sort of pulled up everything short. In a period of 2 or 3 days, they ousted Fiedler
from the editorship of the journal.
From the editorship, yeah. And they spent a year and a half wringing their hands about what to do with the articles they accepted, but they ultimately published them with like a Roger Maris style asterisk. Right?
Gotcha.
So with a
Yeah.
little thing saying, these are the papers that led to the ousting of Klaus Fiedler, and da da da. So, but they did publish them. So,
But
but
so a bunch of your colleagues across the country signed a letter, saying you were racist. What else happened to you?
well, nothing else happened to me.
I mean, no,
I
I'm
mean,
not trying to minimize that, but did anybody try to, send the letter
no,
to
I
your
mean,
dean, or, were you still chair at
no.
the time?
Well,
I can't
I
remember.
have had that happen, but not in this incident, right? I had that
Okay.
in other incidents. Yeah, 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 yeah. But not in this one. No, I mean, it was a little bit uncomfortable within my department for a couple weeks, because of the denunciation and all this sort of stuff. But
Were you
but it
chair at the
wasn't.
time, or no? Was this after you were
No,
chair?
no. By then I was on sabbatical. Yeah, by then
Okay.
I was on sabbatical. Yeah, 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 yeah. So it was like, it was really, and ultimately they published it. It was fine. So, I mean, so what you have there, I mean, the open letter called for the retraction of all the papers, right? So, it endorsed the calling all of us racists, and it had all sorts of nasty, sort of authoritarian stuff in it. So I would say the open letter was pretty bad. It was a clear case of attempt to engage in reputational shaming and ostracism and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
But it didn't. It didn't succeed. I mean, it might have succeeded in small circles, but uh,
Do
it
you?
was fine.
Okay. So let's unpack that. First of all, remind me, what year was this letter? I can't actually remember.
2022.
Okay, 2022. So we're a couple of years removed from the absolute height of,
Yeah,
2020
yeah,
hysteria. So it sounds like, again, not to minimize the experience of having thousands of people sign a letter saying you're a bad person, which really is a bad thing. Um, do, have you perceived any material cost to it, to your career? Did you start getting fewer invitations? Did it sounds like you weren't chair. You have since become chair of a new department, which
right,
so obviously it doesn't. Obviously, no one in the university read this letter and thought he shall never again be chair. Uh,
right, yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and so did you do you feel that there were any lasting consequences? And if not, how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that kind of the moment for such things had passed, and how much has to do with the fact that you're kind of a known quantity, if that makes
Yeah,
sense?
it's
Like,
more the latter. I would say it's more the latter. I think there were a fair number of people long before this incident who, I just generally piss off, who don't like me,
uh-huh.
and I don't think there are any more. There might be a few more, but the field is so gigantic, it just hardly matters. For
Right.
there's probably in the U.S. and Europe, which is where most social psychologists are, certainly where most who are going to review for English language journals, there's probably 20,000 social psychologists. So,
Yeah. And most of them don't
if I
care
get,
about these spats.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
That's
just
that's
not,
my experience too.
yeah, yeah,
And by the way, that now correct me if the following is wrong, but my perception is that in an important way that goes both ways, right? So while it's true from the perspective of somebody who might worry about engaging in heterodox scholarship that they may be overestimating the number of colleagues that will dislike them, it's also true both that probably conservatives outside the academy who read these news stories about these extreme, letters get a biased high impression of how many faculty are actually like this and behave, this way. Number one.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know what I think about that. I advised a dissertation a couple years ago, 2022 or 23, by Nate Honeycutt, who's now a researcher at FIRE, the Foundation
And
for
sorry,
Freedom of
before you go down
Information.
this rabbit hole, the other thing I was going to say was just that the I wonder if it's also the case that people who engage in this behavior vastly underestimate how much their colleagues think they look stupid and
Yeah,
petty.
I think
Yeah.
that is probably true. Corey Clark has a paper finding that
Oh, I
most,
saw this. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
would agree that the behavior is contemptible. Right.
Yep.
So there is a lot of opposition to this, but at the same time,
Yeah, tell me about Nate Honeycutt.
So his dissertation surveyed almost 2,000 faculty and 2,000 grad students. It's like 1,800 each, something like that. And one of the centerpieces was he just asked them to self-identify their politics. And 40% of the faculty self-identified as radicals, activists, Marxists, or socialists. That's
Which, by
40%.
the way, I've said this in a couple of different contexts, but like I try to imagine what would liberals do if it came out, for example, that schools of education, their most praised and cited and assigned texts were written by literal Nazi sympathizers whose Nazi sympathizing was tied to their most important ideas that they're famous for. What would we do if we found that out? My guess is that the liberals would, if anything, do more than what conservatives are
Right.
doing. And yet, if you replace Nazism with communism, that's pretty much the situation in today's schools of education.
Right. Yeah. I've had like two or three viral tweets in my years on Twitter, and one was where I asked exactly this question: why is it that Nazism is so stigmatized, but Marxism is like we're all, it's fine. I mean, outside of conservative circles, it's wildly popular in intellectual circles.
My theory do you want to know? I think I have an answer to that. Do you want to hear it? Or
Yeah, go for it.
so I think, and my answer is a positive one, not a normative one. This is why I think this is true. I don't agree with it, but I think basically, fascism and Nazism tells you it's evil, and because it does, it's easy to oppose it. Whereas communism and Marxism tells you it's good, and many, not all, some of the ways that it becomes evil are pretty explicit, extensions of, victim mentalities. But some of them are just because people who implement these ideologies are idiots, right? So if you think about like the Great Leap Forward, what do they want to do? They wanted to catch up to Britain in industrial prowess, and they wanted to reduce rural poverty. Well, who could be against that? But they had really dumb ideas, that were ideologically driven about how to do that.
Right.
And so my theory is that because the far left does damage through naivety as much or more as through explicit malice, or even when it's explicit malice, it's kind of couched in high-minded language. Both it's harder to oppose, but also it will tend to do more damage. So I suspect that that's why communism killed more people than Nazism. I suspect that's why, the violent protests and anti-police stuff in 2020 killed way more people than January 6th, et cetera. Anyway, that's my theory to answer your question.
No, I think that sort of analysis was part of what came up. And people responded; they were very thoughtful, and that was a major theme of some of the responses. That Marxism is cloaked in benevolence. Compared to, my question was about Nazism. You brought in fascism, which probably would have been a better question. Nazism was also a local nationalistic ideology. So
right, some people say it's right, but also left. That's why I always say fascism, just kind of get away from that, but also make it more modern. The other thing is that naive, high-minded stupidity is, I think, something that academia is uniquely vulnerable to, right? Because we don't harm ourselves directly by being wrong, right? If it's not like we're soldiers on a battlefield who die if we make a bad decision, or business people who lose money if we make a bad decision. The main direct feedback that we get is peer review, and so having attention-grabbing ideas and pleasing ideas can be as important in some cases as having correct ideas. And because of academic freedom, which is good and important, we are intentionally shielded by our profession from the consequences of our bad ideas. Because if we didn't, then we wouldn't be as willing to take risks, which again, if understood properly, is a good thing that we take risks. But I always tell my students, this is why academics need to be particularly humble intellectually, because we are one of the only places in the world that's, set up to enable stupidity in the name of intelligence. And we need to be aware of that and humble. Yeah.
I agree with all that. I would put it slightly differently, although I completely agree with it. And that's that for most of our ideas, we have no skin in the game. This is
that's what I was getting at. But that's the same idea.
Yeah. And so we can go off and on things that kind of sound good and are impressive to our colleagues for years or decades or whatever, and we can kind of thrive more narrowly. In my field, you can do some flashy study that I cited thousands and thousands of times. garners, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars of grants to study with its stereotype threat or microaggressions or implicit bias. And then as over the next 30 or 40 years, the stuff is found either to be irreplicable or just not cracked up to not what it's cracked up to be. The stereotype threat stuff looks like it's irreplicable. The implicit bias stuff looks like most of the key claims have had to be walked back, at least to anyone except an advocate. There was a recent Target article on implicit bias and discussion. One of the commentaries described it as a degenerating line of research because rather than studying implicit bias as a psychological phenomena, it's like the ins and outs of what the IAT actually measures. Does it measure this? And that's what it's called, the degenerating line of research. It's a retreat and retreat and retreat. Anyway, but that takes 20, 30, 40 years to unfold. And if you're the person who originated it 30, 40 years ago, you've already had a great career. You've become, a prestigious, eminent professor. You've been admitted to the National Academies of Science. You've been grant funded your entire career. You've had a great career. So,
and there's a parallel to political extremes among just citizens, right? Demographically, both extreme ends of the spectrum in the US are disproportionately rich, white, and educated. And when I try to explain that intuitively to people, what I always say is like, look, if you're on the extreme ends, if you're in the middle, if you're in the margins, politics affects your day-to-day life viscerally, and you don't have, the luxury to experiment with getting rid of the police, for example, right? But if you're on the extremes, politics is a shirt, and you want your shirt to be more colorful and more attention-grabbing than your neighbor's shirt. Students.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Okay, this is fascinating, but I do want to get back to cancel culture a little bit because I think you have an interesting take on it, and you've written, advice for how to withstand it and all that stuff. So let me ask you this: you alluded to instances where people, demanded that you be removed, say as chair, or face some material consequence beyond just denouncing you.
Yeah.
How did the leaders of your university respond? And how did you respond?
Well, so the first, this was the first time I was exposed to all of this. Was maybe 2018 or 2019. And someone I know from Twitter, she also had a podcast years ago, I was on it, tweeted something like, maybe it was a response to some overwrought claims about sexism. She tweeted something like, women are doing just fine, thank you very much. Or women in America are doing just fine. It was something like that. And this, I don't know whether she was a grad student or a postdoc in Ireland. She was an immigrant from some African country. I don't remember which one at this point. Quote tweeted that, white women, white womening.
Oh yeah, I remember when that was a saying.
That was a thing. And on Twitter, I called that a racist sneer.
Because it is.
Because it
is. Anyway,
is.
What happened? Yeah.
Okay, so I actually have a paper, it's more of an essay for a collection, for an edited book, that goes through this in some detail, which I might post on my Substack at some point. She accuses me of harassing her, and of course of being a racist and harassing her. And she has enough of a following that hundreds of people start denouncing me, and some contact Rutgers. They sent emails, they tagged Rutgers on Twitter, and this got to my dean. So I was chair at the time. And my associate dean, who I've he's no longer dean, had a good relationship with. I meet with him on stuff all the time because there's always business to take care of. We have one of those meetings. We do regular business. And then at the end, he brings up this little Twitter firestorm. And he says two things. You have the academic freedom to do anything you like, to say pretty much anything you like.
And Rutgers is a public university, correct?
Yeah.
So you are covered by the First Amendment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So you're not going to get fired for anything like this. But the administration really doesn't want to be embroiled in this kind of controversy. And, I'm paraphrasing now because it was whatever, 7 years ago. They don't have to actually keep you on as chair.
Gotcha.
And then he said, and so now this is beginning to get my back up. But then he says, which brought back some of the heat for me, do you really want to court this kind of nonsense? Do you really want to get involved in this? Is this what you want to spend your time doing? And that actually calmed me down. And I came around to agreeing that he was basically right. That I really didn't need that. And so I agreed to back off those kinds of confrontations, which I did. I still engaged in certain kinds, but not there were ways I could avoid stuff like that. And I have.
Yeah,
I have
always tell me if this is in the same spirit. I always try to call out patterns rather than specific people as much as possible.
Yeah.
Because usually if something that a specific person is doing is worth calling out, it's a pattern. And then usually if it's a pattern, it's not necessarily fair to call the specific person. I would say the only exception, which you might relate to, is if it's in direct response to somebody attacking me directly.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I don't know what to do with that because there's certainly nothing wrong with highlighting dysfunctional patterns. So that's fine. But it almost goes back to something at least kindred to or adjacent to having skin in the game. That is, it's one thing to call out a pattern, it's another thing to recognize it when it manifests in the real world. And the only way to do that is to highlight the instances of it in the real world, which usually means referring to a particular person, because it's people who do these things. So.
But actually, let me ask you a follow-up question, because this is something that I've often struggled with. And if you read my recent Chronicle of Higher Education piece, you might recognize this particular struggle. And that is, there are a lot of things happening in academia that, you and I and 80% of Americans would find concerning. And I happen to know where the skeletons are buried at the universities I've been in recently. But I also have no reason to think that the skeletons in my university are any worse than the skeletons in other universities. And I'm referring to, my current university, Colorado. As far as I know, actually, my new university is leading the way in reform in some of the areas that we would identify as reform. Great. And I also don't know if they have skeletons where they are yet. But so, and then couple that with the fact that, most of my colleagues are good people doing good work, trying to do so in an upstanding way. And so that's where I find the struggle happens is so far my instinct has been, I would rather call out the general phenomenon and only, show the receipts in cases where people are not going to believe that the general phenomenon exists if I don't. The Chronicle of Higher Education piece on diversity hiring being an example. And again, even there, I tried to be above board. I explicitly reached out to the head of issues management of the campus and some of the other leaders before publishing the article to make sure I had my facts right and to also make it clear.
I did read that. I didn't know which one you were referring to. So I'm like, what is he talking about? I did read. Yeah, that was a great piece.
And thank you. Partly to make sure I got my facts right, and also just to make clear that they knew that the point of my writing that article was to start a national conversation about a national phenomenon. It wasn't to embarrass them, even though, I recognize that one of the examples I was providing might embarrass them.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's your take on this? Because I think it's parallel to what you're talking about in this case. Do you call out if somebody's behaving badly? Do you call that person out specifically by name and invite this type of controversy, which can seem petty? Where on the one
It
hand,
really depends.
yeah.
Yeah,
What do you
first
think?
we all have to choose our battles, right? You
Yeah,
can't fight every battle. So you can't fight every stupid thing that comes along out there, right? So there's that. Um, then there's, one of the things I have really backed off from a lot is doing battle on Twitter because it's useless. You're not, it's just
yeah, I'm
stupid.
with you there.
Yeah, it's just not. I mean, there is a lot of like revelation. It's almost like we almost need something like a libs of TikTok for academia, who just posts the nonsense. I mean, she's become just a right wing poster, but for a while she was posting all this crazy stuff
Yeah,
that was
I
on
was
TikTok.
quoted once recently in I think it was Christian Science Monitor piece about controversy in climate science, where apparently I said to her in the interview, the worst thing to happen to climate scientists on Twitter was climate scientists on Twitter,
Yeah, right, okay.
which is, I think,
So
kind of
so
what you're
there's
talking about. It's sort of, we've done far
right,
more damage to our reputations just by,
right,
pulling the
right, by
veil over
revealing how
how
we
we talk
actually
to each
think about
other.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So there's that.
Yeah.
But then there are peer review articles. I mean, my view is that anything in a peer review article is fair game. I mean,
Sure.
this is
Yeah.
sort of how science is supposed to
I think
work,
that's fair.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, right? So that may mean me saying this particular article by these particular researchers is a disaster area. Here's what it claims. Here's why I think it is spectacularly wrong. So that strikes me as complete fair game. They can't do that with every article you don't like, but you choose your battles, and in some sense, the the people or person whose article you're criticizing will probably feel attacked. They might feel that even if it's a completely sort of analysis critique of the claims in the article, they will
Sure.
likely feel it's a personal attack, and they
Yeah.
may respond accordingly. But
Even if
I
you don't, by the way, criticize them
right,
directly, you think. One of the things I always tell my graduate students is you need to develop, whether or not you engage in controversial topics, you should develop a thick skin, because if you want to do paradigm shifting research, you're going to end up breaking somebody's paradigm.
right,
They're probably going to be somebody
right,
who's powerful and unhappy that you did that.
right. Yes, that's exactly right. So you do need a thick skin to do that. So
Yeah.
I mean, your original point is, this going back and forth between general principles or patterns and calling out individual people or using concrete examples. And for me, there's not it's not a hard distinction, because you can't call out every example. Sometimes it may be just inappropriate. Sometimes you just don't want to deal with the conflict that will ensue. But if you decide to do battle over some principle or some pattern that you see as dysfunctional, then identifying specific instances, which will usually be linked to people, can be necessary. Can be
Sure.
necessary.
Yeah.
So
So let me ask you this. Two more questions, or high level questions, and then we should wrap up. So we talked a little bit about how to face down cancel culture when it comes after you, right? So, and you've written about it. I encourage folks to look up Unsafe Science as your Substack. You've talked about how you don't apologize. I mean, maybe in brackets, unless you have something to apologize for, right? Kind of in your own view. Um, you know, Pick your battles. Don't back down from principled ones. But I think the flip side that we talk about less, especially in spaces, heterodox spaces, is how do you engage as a heterodox person who will sometimes face public attacks, without becoming, a reactionary, anti woke tinfoil hat MAGA crusader, right? Uh, and I won't name names because I'm calling about patterns and not people, but we all know some
yeah,
examples of such folks. Because maybe in academia we're shielded a little bit from the incentives of this, but I think as you go a little bit outside of academia, the incentives are really strong, right? There's many people, and by the way, I'm not included. I don't think Jordan Peterson has become this. I think he has, idiosyncratic range of views, some of which are conservative, that he's been fairly consistent on. But he has this saying that I really think is funny, where he said that he monetized social justice warriors. And and you can see, he's become very wealthy, largely due to the public persona that he's gained from kind of being an early heterodox person. And you see, some other folks, and again, I won't name names, but there are definitely some other public pundits, some of whom started as academics and some of whom didn't, who have gone down this rabbit hole of becoming very reactionary, kind of very hard right.
Yeah.
And, and there's clearly an incentive for it. You're rejected by this crowd, and then this crowd embraces you with open arms, and you want to be liked by somebody, and you don't want to be the person that kind of nobody likes and nobody trusts. Plus there's all these financial incentives. You keep getting invited to these, Turning Point USA conferences where you can, talk about how horrible the lives are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, how have you managed? My perception, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and you've actually become a firebrand, reactionary without me noticing. But my impression is that, kind of like Jordan Peterson and others of, varying views, you have a set of views, some of which are provocative and some of which are heterodox, but I don't sense that you've really changed your views that much, as this cancel culture period has gone on. And so kind of, how do you think about that? Do you ever feel the pull of like, gosh, if I was just like a little bit more of a tinfoil hat MAGA person, I could have more subscribers on my Substack, or not?
Yeah.
Do you not think about this?
Yeah. I mean, you laid out what the seductive appeal of that, I think, is, right? It's like you're rejected over here, you're welcome over there. There are incentives, both social and financial, to do that. So, it's very seductive. So I can see why people do that. That doesn't really answer your question. Your answer question is why haven't?
Yeah, why don't you do that? That's my question.
I can't do it because I don't believe most. It's just like I'm not gonna pretend to believe something to gain all this other stuff. So that's off the table for me. And
do you think that in a weird way that's related to your ability to be heterodox in the first place amidst cancel culture?
Yeah.
Like what I always say to people about my heterodoxy is I don't actually like conflict. I'm a good Canadian that way. I strongly dislike conflict, but I also find, bending the knee ideologically when intellectual integrity is supposed to be my trade so humiliating that I refuse to do it for anybody, be them, progressive academics or conservatives.
Yeah. No, that's exactly for me. That speaks for me. I just like, I'm sort of center left in my politics. I ran an indivisible group. You know what an indivisible group is?
No.
So these were these small political action groups formed in the aftermath of Trump's election.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I do remember these. Yeah. But anyway, our listeners may not. So please continue.
Yeah. So they were small, leftish political action groups. And mine was small. I only did it for about a year. But I don't want to attribute this to my group. My group was part of a very successful effort. You may remember in 2017, Trump was elected president. Republicans had both the House and the Senate.
Yep.
And one of their first orders of business was to repeal Obamacare.
Almost, but yes.
Well, that was their agenda, was to repeal it.
Yes. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Sorry.
And it came up to votes in both the House and the Senate. And my group, I live in a town in New Jersey that at the time had a like moderate Republican congressman. And we engaged, the big we, not just my group. We were part of a series of linked indivisible groups. Our goal was to flip that congressman from being willing to repeal Obamacare to vote against the repeal. And we succeeded. You can look this up. Leonard Lance, Republican congressman, 2017, New Jersey, voted against the repeal.
And there's a broad pattern here, by the way, which is that contrary to what most academics believe, the median voter is an economic progressive and a social conservative.
Yeah,
And so
yeah, yeah.
the Republicans elites pull them into unpopular economic positions, and the Democratic elites pull them into unpopular cultural ones. Okay,
Yes,
I've already taken up too much of your time, so I wanted to finish with one question. And just the setup for it is that this is my last season as host of the Free Mind podcast. There's 4 episodes in the season, and each of the guests are in some way connected to the conversation about higher ed reform. To what extent is it needed? How should we go about it? Anybody can look you up and see that you think that it's needed, and so I'm not even going to ask you that. But let me ask you about the how to do it part. And I would say among heterodox academics, I've encountered 3 schools of thought. There's the school of thought of any government intervention is a threat to academic freedom and is a slippery slope not worth going down. There's a school of thought of academia is so captured ideologically, not just by the left, but by the far left, that they won't reform themselves, especially given the peer review reward structures, without significant government intervention. And so we have to do it. And by the way, government is accountable to the people anyway, and we get so much government money that there should be accountability to the popular whim, academic freedom be damned. And then the third group, which in my experience among heterodox people I've talked to, I would say is the largest numerically, is kind of in between. And it's kind of like, and I don't like this analogy, and I apologize if it's indelicate, but the chemotherapy analogy. Basically, it's like chemotherapy is bad for the human body, but when you have cancer, you need it. And so too with government intervention in academia. The basic government intervention in academia is a slippery slope. It does threaten academic freedom. But so, the first group is right, but the second group is right too, that we're not going to fix ourselves. And so some type of government intervention is necessary. What's your take? And if you support government intervention, what types and how? And if not, why not?
Yeah, well, the second and third groups don't seem to me all that different, actually. It's just the third group has a metaphor for why the second group is basically justified, right? Right? It's like,
let me expand that. First of all, I will own the metaphor. I've never heard it from anyone's mouth except for mine. But here's where I think it is different, right? The third group is, in my experience, much more cautious about what types of government intervention they'll endorse, right? So government intervention to enforce academic freedom policies, even to enforce institutional neutrality, sure. Government intervention to, ban things that sound like certain disciplines, even ones that they find, intellectually vacuous and morally reprehensible, they're not on board with in academic freedom grounds. They don't really like or not really comfortable with what Chris Rufo is doing in New College of Florida, but maybe they're okay with most of what's going on at University of Florida or University of North Carolina. Does that make sense? As sort of what distinguished whereas I say that the second camp is really like, yeah, just we just got to come in with a bulldozer and raise everything and then rebuild it. And I apologize if I'm mischaracterizing Chris Rufo's view there, but and those who do agree with him.
Yeah, so society-wide, I would actually endorse all of that because we don't know what's going to work and we don't know what's necessary. So I don't know that Rufo's come in with a bulldozer. I mean, they're coming in, and what has he done? He's changed some hiring requirements and stuff. I mean, what else has he done?
Well, I think he's more. Didn't he close a department or a department closed? I know he got rid of the DEI office, but that's different. That's not academic.
Exactly.
But I thought that the women's studies department was under threat. I mean, even if that's not the case in Chris Rufo's case, I can tell you that the parts of the legislature in Wyoming where I'm going has twice tried to defund the gender studies department. Both times blocked by the moderate Republicans, I should add.
Really?
Because people think sometimes it's the left, right? And blocked on free speech grounds.
Right. Yeah. So, well, good for them. There is this strong, my sense is there is a strong libertarian current throughout the Western states.
That's
the
correct.
Western,
Yes.
yeah. And they were they were most of the first states to legalize marijuana, which, you would think that would happen on the East Coast,
Well, I think
East or West
Wyoming was
Coast.
the first state to give women the vote.
Is that, yeah? So that's just very interesting politically, because people think about Democrats and Republicans on this left-right thing, but
Right.
libertarian is kind of different. So anyway, some of the legislation, especially the Florida legislation, seems to me to be, it's not just anti-academic freedom, it's anti-free speech. Like, the government can't be in the business of telling people what they
Right.
can and cannot say, including people at colleges and universities. So that legislation is a problem. Beyond that, the governors using their authority to install, what are they, the board of governor representatives that they want, that strikes me as a legitimate use of political authority. That, if you don't want your governor to have that power, change the damn state laws and
Right.
constitution.
Exactly. The constitutions in the states are explicit that they have that power.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. I agree with that.
and that state universities have some degree of being beholden to the state, basically the people of the state as represented by their elected officials. That doesn't strike me as ridiculous either. So that whether states or the federal government want to alter funding based on various practices, that seems like a legitimate use of power.
Well,
So
but let's again, without extending this episode longer than I booked you for. Although we could talk for hours, it'd be fascinating. It strikes me that the devil's in the details there a little bit, right? The saying that that elected officials have the power to install politically appointed trustees. Sure, that's explicitly the case in some states. The trustees have the power to oversee some university practices. Okay, again, sure, but it does matter a little bit which ones, right? So, for example, in Colorado, where our trustees are elected, directly by the people, even there's very clear norms and rules about what they control, and the trustees, they call them regents, what the regents control and what the regents don't control. And in particular, that every effort is made to not allow the regents to control the curriculum for academic freedom reasons.
right. Yeah, controlling the curriculum, I haven't thought much about controlling curriculum. Seems like a bad idea, but controlling hiring and like what departments and programs and positions, that strikes me as a completely legitimate exercise of the authority of the Board of Governors.
Even if that power is wielded against departments for nakedly political reasons, right? We are defunding this department because we don't like your politics.
Well, do they defund? There's defunding. I didn't talk about funding. So
that's what we were talking about. I don't know specific examples of trustees doing this to departments, except maybe at the New College of Florida, but I can't remember. But certainly that's a concern, right? That politically motivated trustees would go after departments for political reasons, and that would erode academic freedom. And I think my impression of at least the pundits who write about this is that some of them are okay with that and think it's necessary, and some think it's a slippery slope.
The devil is always in the details. If a university decides that it is about political activism, then having a department that is a politically activist department is completely consistent with the mission. If the university decides that it is about truth-seeking and institutional neutrality, and it has a department that's up to its ears in activism, I think it would be completely justified to excise that department.
As a violation of his mission. Well, on that not at all controversial note, we'll end there. Thanks so much, Lee Jussim, for coming on the Free Mind podcast. Fascinating as always. I encourage our listeners to check out your Unsafe Science blog, look you up on Google Scholar, look up your research, and you are often a guest on these sorts of podcasts and other types of popular forums, outspoken and well-spoken, heterodox academic. So thanks again, and I'm sure we'll see you around.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation, Matt. Thank you.
The Free Mind podcast is produced by the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can email us feedback at freemind@colorado.edu or visit us online at colorado.edu/center/Benson. You can also find us on social media. Our Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube accounts are all at Benson Center. Our Instagram is at The Benson Center, and the Facebook is at Bruce D. Benson Center.